Okay, I decided to talk about Polytrichum juniperum and pilliferum. They're very closely related. And I picked them because they're fairly easy and I'm a novice. So um, now that they are both in what there's been a big discussion about whether or not you pronounce this Polytrichum or Polytrichum. And I still don't know which is correct. If you go and Google it, it comes out Polytrichum. But that's in like American English or something like that. And I couldn't find the correct um, uh, correct pronunciation in botanical language. But anyway, these guys are part of the Polytrichaceae family. In that family in New Mexico and Colorado, there are um, four different genus, four different genera. There's Atrichum with a couple of Atrichum salwinii in Colorado and New Mexico, and Tenellum but only in New Mexico. And then Polytrichum, um, Juniperum pilliferum commune are in both states. Strictum and Jensenii are in Colorado, and Ohioenses in New Mexico. It's interesting that, there's so many that are in one state but not another. And then the third genus is Polytrichascum, Polytrichastrum. And there is Lealii is only in New Mexico. Alpinum is in both. And then Longicidum and Formosum are only in Colorado. And then another uh, genus, Pogonatum, I guess that's called Uroganorum, and that's only in Colorado. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about both of the keys that we use to key these. Weber and Whitman, which is the Colorado key, was written in 2007, and since that time, they've moved some of the species around a little bit. There used to be a Meotrichum lealii in Colorado. That's been moved into Polytriastrum. And then there are a couple of Polytriastrums, Longicidum and Formosum, that have been moved into Polytrichum longicidum. And I don't know why they move these around, but so they are moved around a little bit. Now that the Polytrichaceae family is we'll start off with the big green book. In the big green book, Polytrichaceae family are one of those groups of species which are separated out right at the beginning of the key in the master key, the primary key. And so I thought it might be kind of fun to go through. You only go through three couplets, and start right from the beginning of the key. So if you go to the primary key in the big green book, the first couplet is basically separating sphagnum out of getting, rid of sphagnum. And I'm not getting rid of it, separating it out in the first couplet. And the couplet reads, 1A is leaf cells arranged in a network of narrow green cells alternating with large hyaline cells, which are clear cells. And I think I'm thinking that Reese, the we started, that you've done this already, but we'll just do it a little bit again. So if you look at the cells, these are the green cells along here, the skinny little green cells. And these are the hyaline cells, and I believe that the hyaline cells are those cells that absorb all the water that make sphagnum puff up as it does. And then the second part of that, our branches are raised in radiate clusters toward the apex. And I picked Sphagnum magellanticum, even though it's a New England moss and it isn't found in either New Mexico or Colorado. I picked it out because the morphology is so clear in this one. These are the branches arranged in radiate clusters. And then the stem is terminated by a head-like cluster of short branches, which is this little group in here. And so if you compare this with Polytrichum juniperum, it's obviously totally different. So it's very easy to separate out. If you cut these cells here, this is what they look like. They alternate the green cells and then the clear cells. So we go to leaf cells and branches, not both as above. So we go to number 2. And in the second couplet, this separates out what we call complanate foliate from the other mosses. So stems with leaves, definitely deciduous in arrangement, which is like arranged on both sides, attached in two obvious rows on opposite sides of the stem, and the shoots definitely complanate foliate. So, and I found this Physidens crispus, which is kind of an extreme example of that. A lot of these complanate ones, you'll see the leaves, overlapping on the sides, but definitely in just 2 rows. And then, but ours are stems with leaves attached all around the stem. And this Polytrichum polyphrum, you can see that these are clearly not flattened out like those. So this takes us to the third couplet, which is our couplet. And these are, this couplet separates out by saying leaves are with lamellae or filaments on the adaxial upper surface of the costa. And so these are the lamellae. And they sit, here's the costa down here, so it's on the adaxial, the other side of it, excluding probigula or gemmi, and I didn't want to get into that because that'll confuse everything. But it's clearly, this is what, our polytrichums look like with the lamellae. And then just to give you an example of one without that, Hymenoloma crispula doesn't have any of those lamellae in it. So then we go to group B, and that takes us to the Polytrichaceae key. And in the big green book, the first couplet says, leaves are strongly crisped or contorted when dry. And you can see that clearly in this Atrichum undulatum. They really are crisped and dry. And if you look at, oh man, I got to keep moving. Oh, maybe I can make this thing small. Oh, I'll never get it back again. Okay. And you can see in our Polytrichum juniperum, these leaves are not crisped or contorted when dry at all. They actually look pretty much the same wet or dry. But the other half of that is in the this couplet, which actually leads to our first genus. Somebody trying to get in? Oh. In the second part of this is in an atrichum is the atrichum lacks a sheath. The margins are strongly toothed, and the costa is narrow, occupying about a quarter or less of the limb. And in our Polytrichum genus, the costa is broad, occupying most of the limb. And so this is what the sheath is. sits at the bottom of the leaf, and you can see in a trichum that there isn't any sheath. This is not. There's nothing distinguished from the rest of the leaf. And you can see here the costa is really narrow and the costa is really fat in Polytrichum juniperum. Costa is broad, occupying most of the limb, and this is the limb up here. The other thing that you see right away is that you can't see through the leaf the way you can here. So you can't see the cells. And I'm figuring that is because of the lamellae. The lamellae are all filled up here, so you can't see through it. So the leaves are not all crisp or contorted. That takes us to the second couplet, which is the leaf margins are folded over the lamellae. So if you do a cross section of the leaf, there are the lamellae. There's the costa down here, and the leaf is folded over the top. And you can see that in Polytrichum juniperum, and this cross-section of Polytrichum polypherum, which I did, which just looks a little messed up, but you can still see the same thing. Compare that with the leaf margins not infolded in Polytrichum alpinum. This is what, the leaf margins just go up there and they don't fold over. So that's really clear if you're good at doing transections, which I'm not, but I did get a lot of practice for this, which was good. And then, so that takes us to the third couplet, which is leaf or awns more or less reddish throughout, which you can see pretty clearly here. And that takes you to Polytrichum juniperum, which is one of our species. Or the leaf awns more or less whitish throughout. And that in these photos, that difference is pretty clear because you can see the awns here pretty clearly. But we'll get into, let's see, where do I go to next? Okay. What I want to do is I want to show you how Weber and Whitman do this because they do it a little bit differently. And I think the reason is because there is a Polytrichum strictum, which occurs in Colorado, doesn't occur in New Mexico. And they had to change the key a little bit to take Polytrichum strictum into account. So the first couplet, they immediately go to leaves with a white hair point, and that takes you immediately to Polytrichum polypherum. And then the other part of that couplet is leaves without a white hair point, in which case you go to 2. And then they do what the Big Green Book does, leaves with margins folded over the lamellae, or leaves with margins plain, not infolded. And then that takes you to this couplet, which separates these two species. Lower stems covered with a white tomentum, plants of high mountain wet meadows, and that is Polytrichum strictum, or the lower stems are naked, and the plants are found in various habitats, and that takes you to Polytrichum juniperum. Now, when I said in this example, it's really easy to see the difference in the hair points, but you got to be careful because Polytrichum alpinum, because its color sometimes is dark brown, it's very easy, and maybe it isn't very easy, but it certainly was easy for me because I pulled up a collection that I had made in 2012, which was right at the beginning of my career, and I had identified this plant as Polytrichum juniperum, because the ends of the leaves look kind of reddish. But as you'll notice here, they don't have awns. Um, Polytrichum juniperum, when Polytrichum juniperum is also this kind of brown color, it's pretty hard sometimes to see the awns. You can see some awns up in here. There's an awn there. And so I went back to this and I keyed it using a cross section. And then it was clear that this was not Polytrichum juniperum because the sides of the leaves were not infolded. So you really need to do that and be a little bit careful of when they're this color. I mean, it's easy when it's easy when they're this color because you can really see the awns, but it's not so easy when the colors are brown, and they go from brown to green. Talk a little bit about the capsules. Polytrichum juniperum the capsules are described in the big green book as 5 millimeters long, sharply four-angled. It's a little hard to see because we're looking at a side here, but there's one of the angles there. And the setae are to 5 centimeters long. And the problem here is that you don't always see the capsules in a mature state, when they've puffed out all their what whatever it is that's in there. When they're in an immature state, they're covered with a hairy calyptra, so you can't really see the shape of the capsules. And in Juniperum Polytrichum polyphorum, the capsules really vary depending on how old they are. The young capsules are long and thin, and in the big green book they're described as being 4 millimeters long, four-angled, and short, almost cubic. But when they're young, you can't really tell that. You have to identify. Well, you generally identify the moss from the leaves anyway. And then in medium age, they plump up a little bit, and then they have their calyptra over the top, the hairy calyptra. So you still can't see the four-angled, short, almost cubic capsules. You only see that when they're in a mature state, which is here. And then another feature of these, which is this is one of my favorite features in mosses, is both in Polyphorum and Juniperum, you have what are called splash cups. Polytrichum, Polyphorum, and Juniperum are dioecious, which means that the male parts and the female parts are on different plants. And in the male parts, they very often have these splash cups, which are, they're really, really noticeable, and they're really pretty. It's one of my favorite things in mosses. And these splash cups are designed when it rains, the drop comes down and hits the cup, and it spreads the sperm. You also see what's called as gemmi splash cups, where you don't have a sperm in here, but you have gemmi, which are little pieces that if they break off from the moss, they can create a whole new moss plant. So you have gemmi and these splash cups. So that is the end of my little talk.